Okay, this is the 10-minute chess lesson, Endgame, for beginners. First, you have to understand, when does the endgame start? Oh, excuse my hat once again. It's cold in here, so I'm leaving my hat on. When does the endgame start? Basically, when the queen comes off the board. When you exchange queens, it's very difficult to complicate the position. It's possible, but it becomes more and more increasingly difficult if you don't have queens on the board. I'll take my glasses off because I get so much reflection. If you don't have queens on the board, the position gets more and more complicated with the queen. If you can get the queens off the board, you're entering your endgame, and you should have a definite strategy for your endgame. If you're ahead in material, if you're 1 pawn up, 2 pawns up, even a piece up, the idea is to exchange off pieces, not pawns, so that you can win the endgame with an extra pawn. If you're a knight up, you exchange off all the other material. You're a knight, you have an extra knight, he has 1 or 2 extra pawns. That knight is going to be able to capture those 2 extra pawns, and hopefully you'll still have a pawn left along with your minor piece. Your minor piece and your king will help you queen that pawn, so that you can win the game using your queen and your king against his lone king. So that's the idea. When you're in the end game, if you have more material, exchange off pieces, not pawns. The reason why you want to exchange off pieces and not pawns, if you lose all your pawns, you cannot promote a pawn to a queen. Of course, if you don't have any pawns, you can't promote a pawn to a queen. You always want to be able to promote one of your extra pawns to a queen. That makes it easier to checkmate your opponent without any problems. If you exchange off all your pawns, yet you have an extra minor piece, that minor piece being a bishop or a knight, you can't checkmate your opponent. A bishop, king and bishop, or king and knight cannot mate your opponent. So use that extra piece to maintain a pawn, queen the pawn, checkmate your opponent, move on to the next game. The other thing about endgames, if you're down in material, then yes, you want to exchange off all the pawns and make it as difficult as possible for your opponent to checkmate you. Another endgame scenario is if you are a rook or a queen up, it's very easy to checkmate your opponent. So just use your rook and your king to force your opponent's king to the edge of the board and mate the king there. We'll go over those, but just to give you an overview, if you're queen and king up, use your queen and king to force your opponent's king to the edge of the board and checkmate your opponent there. It is not possible with the king and queen to checkmate your opponent in the center of the board. It's not possible with the king and rook to checkmate your opponent in the center of the board. Now, if you have a king and 2 rooks, you could do it, but it's more difficult, so why? If you have 2 rooks, do the same thing. Force your opponent to the edge of the board, checkmate him there. It's a lot easier. If you have 1 pawn extra, a king and pawn against a lone king, you can ultimately checkmate your opponent, but you have to promote that pawn to a queen and use the queen and king to mate your opponent. If you have 2 pawns, it's that much easier. But as a beginner, you always have to watch for stalemate. Do not stalemate your opponent. Force him to the edge of the board, mate him there. Usually the way beginners stalemate their opponents when they have an extra queen or an extra rook, number one, they play around in the center of the board for about 30 moves, which is totally unnecessary. Force your opponent to the edge of the board, but don't just use your queen close to your opponent's king. All your queen has to do is cut off one, either rank or file, and then the king comes over to help out and you mate him. What often happens is the beginner uses queen right next to, well, not right next to him, but very close to his opponent's king, and then will walk his king over to the area where the queen already is, and that next step stalemates the opposing king. And of course, a stalemate is a draw where you don't have any places to move. If your opponent cannot move without putting himself in check, that's a draw. It's a stalemate and it's a draw. The other ways to draw your opponent, there's a 50 move rule, and you're going to have to check that because I haven't actually gone to the official rule book in years. But in a classical game of chess, there's a 50 move rule. In casual games, people love to change the rules. Well, it's 20 moves, it's 5 moves, it's 2 moves. No, it's 50 moves. If you go 50 moves without advancing a pawn or exchanging a piece or a pawn, the game's a draw. I'm pretty sure it's without advancing a pawn. I'm going to have to check that. But in any case, it's 50 moves, 50 move rule. Another way that you can draw the game, especially in the endgame, is by repetition. Threefold repetition. If you repeat the exact same position 3 times, it's a draw. The theory behind that is neither of the players is making any real effort to improve their position, so you might as well draw it. Okay, you can also have a draw by agreement, but beginners very seldom will draw by agreement. That doesn't make much sense. 50 move rule, 3 move repetition, draw by agreement, stalemate are the major ways to have a draw. A draw, of course, means a tie. Each of the players get a half a point. In casual games, you won't be paying that close of attention. What else about the end game? Pawn structure is very important in the end game. Make sure that you have the better pawn structure. That simply means that you have a pawn structure that will result some way, somehow, in a passed pawn for you. Once you obtain your passed pawn, your opponent has to respect that. That passed pawn can be advanced, has to keep his pieces or king near that passed pawn while you create some type of advantage in another sector of the board. Usually just one passed pawn by itself will not force the win. I was in a situation where there were nothing but pawns and kings on the board, but all the pawns were locked. None of the pawns could be advanced. My opponent did have a passed pawn, but my king could sit there and block that pawn from advancing. His king couldn't come across because all the files were blocked by pawns. Even though he had an extra pawn, he wasn't able to utilize it. So remember that if you're ahead of material, force your opponent into the end game, exchange off pieces but not pawns. If you're behind in material, stay away from the end game, but if you are forced into the end game, make sure you exchange off those pawns, keep your pieces. That'll give you a better chance for a draw. What I'm trying to do today is actually keep the video to 10 minutes. And I think I have achieved that end. And of course, we'll be going through some in-game patterns where you can actually see the mating process. But you can go anywhere and see that. And if you actually did purchase the basic beginner's chess book, they'll show you that in there as well. I'll explain it to you how you can force to win with the queen, how you can force to win with the queen and 2 rooks, how you can force to win with the queen and 1 rook. They should also express that a knight and bishop cannot force a checkmate. I believe 2 bishops can force a checkmate, but it takes forever. I've been playing chess for over 50 years now. I have never had to mate my opponent with 2 bishops or with a bishop and a knight. The game is usually decided way before then, even with the best of players. They are not going to let themselves enter in game with 2 bishops or a bishop and a knight if they can in any way avoid it, and usually you can. That's all for now. Look forward to creating the next video. Take care. Bye-bye.